Welcome to Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, the weekly podcast that features the very best in productivity and career development in the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Patton McDowell, and happy to give you actionable ideas that can elevate your current or perhaps your future nonprofit organization. Well, thanks for listening, and as always, for your great feedback. Glad to bring you these weekly conversations with nonprofit leaders who are really on the cutting edge of our sector. And speaking of feedback, leave us a review on the podcast platform of your choice. Thank you for helping us get the word out and meet our goal of expanding this audience. We want to get in front of more current and aspiring nonprofit leaders all over the world. I had a great conversation in this episode with Jennifer Harris, who brings significant experience in the nonprofit sector and a wonderful approach to fundraising that we all need to hear. The good news is that her style of authentic fundraising is not only effective, but it's the right thing to do. And it'll help you become even more comfortable raising funds, especially if that's not your forte. And I get it. Not all of us are comfortable fundraising, and this will help you do just that. Now, Jennifer and I talk about what exactly is an authentic ask in the fundraising arena, and how do we practice it? How do we get better? How do we create a culture of gratitude within our nonprofit and all of the constituents that we are in touch with? And how do we get our board members engaged in this process so they will be more comfortable and effective fundraisers? Well, Jennifer and I tackle all of these questions and much more. So don't forget to check out the show notes. It's episode number 85. Just go to the podcast or the news page at pattonmcdowell.com and you'll find all of the resources Jennifer and I discuss, as well as more information on her and the great work she's doing through the JH Collective. Speaking of resources, go to our website and connect with us. Don't forget to get on our email list so you can get the free weekly resources that are coming out, to include episodes just like this one, and let us know if we can help your nonprofit with its strategic planning, board engagement, or fundraising, or maybe we can help you on your nonprofit leadership journey through coaching, training, or our mastermind programs. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Jennifer Harris. Jennifer, thank you for joining me on the path.
Hello.
It is fun to have you in this environment of podcasting, Jennifer. You got lots of good things to talk about. In particular, two topics that I think are on the minds of nearly every nonprofit leader you and I deal with. Fundraising, being more effective and authentic is the key word for you, I know. And also board engagement. How do we engage these critical volunteers, especially in this virtual environment? And so I'm just excited to unpack both of those topics and perhaps a few more. But before we do that, Jennifer, talk about your journey in nonprofit leadership and kind of what has brought you to now the work you're doing through the JH Collective.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. So I would say that, or will say, I have been in the nonprofit and sort of academic sector for about 17 years. And I like to say that my career path has been an integration of education and nonprofit work in academia, in healthcare, and in the humanities. And all of that has colored my fundraising practice, my nonprofit leadership work, and my strategic communications work that I do with clients. So I do say often that I work at the intersection of fundraising, communications, and strategy. And I've sort of appropriated the practice of holism, like to connect up those kind of three forces in our field to advance missions. And it's been, really much so evolved into, my career has really evolved into a practice that uplifts authenticity, storytelling, health, individual and organizational, and community health. So the human condition. So it's really an integrative journey that's alive and still evolving.
Love that. And I love we're seeing your storytelling ability already. That intersection, I think, is critical. And I think often nonprofit leaders will go too narrowly down any one of those paths you described, fundraising maybe as an example, but it is about communication and authentic community building and things. So I know you'll share more of that as well. But Jennifer, before
Yeah.
we jump into some of your headline topics, everybody's dealing with this strange virtual environment. How have you managed to keep all of the things moving in an effective way? Any particular tips or tricks you found to your personal productivity?
Yeah. So I actually love that you even used the word moving, because I think movement, both, from the inside out, is essential. Moving our bodies also helps us move our minds and spirits. So for me, when you asked, I think in advance of our conversation about what a tool or tactic is, I really started to reflect on what's been essential for me every day is to get up and move, whether it's stretch, or move my hands by journaling. So I may talk a little bit about writing for health.
Good.
It's a practice of getting blood flow, both literally through our bodies and, figuratively from head to heart and heart to head and back again. So whatever it is, a movement practice, that you can do in the morning, whether it's writing, journaling, stretching, jogging, walking around the block, centering. That's something that I recommend before we move from a place of, no barriers from bedroom to desk, right?
That's so true. And you're right. It's so easy to fall victim to just a nonstop day of screen staring.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I love the fact that you're kind of getting the day started in the right way. And I'm guessing, do you do that throughout the day as well, Jennifer? Do you kind of mix up what is, your virtual world with some more movement during the day?
I try, I think a lot of people have introduced me to different apps that alert you to get up from your desk
Yes,
and move your
yes.
body. But, I fall prey to what we call flow, especially if I'm in a big development communications project where I find myself writing for hours or, yeah. So I certainly try. And I think, especially in this kind of work from home or telecommute kind of environment, we have to build in barriers. We really have to block time on our calendar. And so that is precisely what I do. I'll put walk, for 20
On the
minutes just
calendar.
on the
Yeah, yeah.
calendar. It's become essential, right? Or I'll just sit and write all day or work all day.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, Jennifer, let's jump into a topic that I know our
Yeah.
listeners are interested in, which, of course, fundraising. Sometimes is a positive word for nonprofit leaders. Other
Yeah.
times it's a scary word or an uncomfortable word. And I love the fact that you've coined a phrase, the authentic ask. And in fact, I think it really took off. It was a viral phenomenon, right? You wrote an article, I think it was a few years ago. Maybe start
Yeah.
with that. What originated the spirit of that article, and so why'd you write it, and what did you mean?
So many things. So I love how you positioned that question, because I have also been thinking about, our profession's reputation, and the way fundraising is received.
Right.
So let's back up. So I wrote The Authentic Ask, or Awakening the Authentic Ask, in 2016. And really, writing has always been a source of healing for me. I actually teach writing for health. It's a path to re-relating to our personal stories and the story of our work and our purpose in the world. And when I left my job in 2012, but when I started really kind of digging into consulting and doing work with organizations across the states, I really was getting into this practice of really thinking about, how do I relate to fundraising? How does the world relate to fundraising? Where are there barriers? Where are the barriers resting in organizations and at the board level? Where are they resting in my heart? Why do I cringe at times when I use words like solicit? So I really
Yes,
started to
yes.
ask myself these big questions like, can changing the way we talk about fundraising change the way we do it? So that was like a big question of mine. And then I started to ask myself, you know, can I fall in love with a field that uses language that in a way that creates dissonance between staff, between leaders, between board members. And so it was an exercise to start, Patton, to be totally honest. I asked myself, okay, can changing the way we talk about fundraising change the way we do it? Then I asked myself, how do I fall in love with this work, right? Like, how do I really find a way to love the work that I'm doing? And does that mean writing a new narrative? Like, can philanthropy be a source of nourishment, for example, for an organization?
Interesting.
Can it be fuel? And I was looking around, right? I was looking for other writers at the time, and nonprofit leaders who were speaking in that way. And there were a few. There's been a handful. I know Henry Nouwen calls it a call to conversation.
Yes.
There are other folks. That being said, I also had at the time a small volume of clients that were in the integrative health space that were really applying language and story in ways that create health in our bodies, and also which then subsequently create health in our work. And so for me, while I was looking at like health vernacular, like language we can use to create health, I was also looking at authentic leadership practices. And so I started writing this essay to grapple with my own story. I really say, again, it was an exercise in re-relating and falling in love with the work. And then when I shared it on LinkedIn, a woman on the East Coast, so I'm in California, as you know, messaged me first on LinkedIn and said, hey, have you ever considered turning this into a workshop? And I thought, wow, how am I going to do this? Like, do people want this?
Right.
Is this my woo-woo stuff, my Brene Brown, journey? And I was also up for the challenge. So before I, kind of rattle off on where that took me, I dug deep into, what started to be a growing body of research in authenticity and organizational health. So there's people outside of our profession who have been doing that work. I think Bill George is one. Obviously, Brene Brown talks about authenticity, both in our lives and in work. So it's just been this evolutionary process. So I always give the writing the credit, right? But it's really become a process of synthesis of thinkers and leaders outside of our profession that I've brought in to my own daily practice, and then have kind of tried to recapitulate it in a way that is meaningful for people who work in the social sector or the nonprofit sector.
It's fascinating, and I'm nodding the whole time you're saying that, because but I was going to ask you, the question was part of your motivation because you saw a lot of inauthentic fundraising activity, and you lifted up an example that I think is classic, the transactional terminology like solicitation. Well, is it any wonder we as fundraisers don't feel really good about that? But let me ask you, was that part of what motivated you to try to put it down in writing?
Absolutely. So I think, and something I'm still working on, Patton, is grappling with that. So I call it often dissonance between kind of tracking, how it was like creating sort of metrics and measures around fundraising and being in a relational emerging practice. So like I said to a client yesterday, here's a better example, perhaps. I said, fundraising is alive, right? It's alive, it's emergent, it's alive. When you have one meeting, we can plan for one meeting, but that meeting will give birth to something else. And that something else is not something that we can necessarily predict. And so I think one of the myths of fundraising is that we can have this sort of best practice that says, if we do X plus Y equals Z, you will close a gift. It's that, like, I know for decades we've talked about, some people say there's an art and science to philanthropy.
Right.
All the language is fine if it serves you. I have come to find that talking about fundraising as an emergent, alive process has given me freedom to be more creative, to be more relational, to be more co-creative with donors, with board members, with the world. A pandemic happens, for example, and so all of our plans, for 2020, for example, may have gone a different direction. So yeah, I think to answer your question, I think that I felt a little like we were living in the restraints or the confines of jargon, that, and I watched it in my office. I watched people, 15 years ago file contact reports because they had to have a certain number of contact reports, not because they had meaningful meetings, right? So like saying that you saw someone at an event versus I had a meaningful phone call with someone, like there's so many things that we've inculcated fundraisers with that I think have resulted in inauthentic transactional practices and that have impacted frankly, our reputation as a profession.
Could not agree more. And I'm guilty of both falling victim to that and perhaps as a leader pushing it. I'm struck by your terms. It was transactional. How many contact reports have I got to file this month? And what is the timeline this prospect is on? If it's 18 months to get him or her to a leadership gift, but I've lost the real relational aspect, haven't I? And I guess that's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely have too. And we play in a sandbox with the toys and the tools that, we're given.
We were given,
and,
right.
Yeah. So when I first started consulting 9 years ago, I immediately was like, what are their metrics? What tools do they have to track? And then what I started to witness, and I'm still witnessing, so this is going to be my forever social experiment, is I'm starting to witness how gifts really come in, right? Like how they truly come in and the unpredictability around that.
Good point.
And that balancing predictability and unpredictability, certainty and uncertainty. It's a balancing act, right? So we can do, like I've said this in board meetings before too, we can pray for abundance or meditate for abundance, but we can also put abundance into action, right? We can put a plan around it. And fundraising for me is the same way because we are seeing gifts come in that are unsolicited often, right? We just saw Mackenzie Scott give unbelievable transformational gifts across the globe during a pandemic year. And none of those recipient orgs had, to my knowledge, someone can totally fact check me, but had
there wasn't 18 months
strategy.
of exactly of
there
contact reports.
Exactly. There wasn't a strategy session. We didn't do research on her. So I'm not saying that is the norm, but what I'm suggesting is we have to look at our practices and balance infrastructure and ideation, planning and emerging, it's both. And I think we get stuck. And as a result, our reputation as professionals in larger orgs is compromised, and our reputation with donors can be compromised when we think we can push them along a timeline that frankly is more organic than what we perceive, right?
Totally agree. Totally.
So yeah, I could go on and on that topic.
Well, and I'm going to ask you to go on some of these topics, and otherwise people are going to have to participate in one of your workshops to really get at this. But what you talk about, I'm quoting you here, that you talk about fundraising from the inside out as well as the outside in. And does that get, Jennifer, at what is a authentic ask? Or let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So I think, so whenever I run a workshop and people ask me, what is the authentic ask? I'll say it's a mindset and a method. So that's often where I start. So you're going to hear me use a lot of both and language. So it's not either or, just like it's not contact reports and relational. It's both and. And so the authentic ask to me is a mindset and a method that connects why we do this work, why we're called to do this work in the first place, fundraising, with how we do it. So that's a place to start, right? It's like why. And so when I say the inside out, whether it's the fundraiser, the team, the org, the board, it's why are we all called to do this work? It is really like dropping inside ourselves and connecting with the mission and our call to purpose. So it's this inner work that, in my experience working in-house, I didn't often see in fundraisers, right? Like we focused on the outer, like what we need to build, what we need to fund, instead of why are we here? Like, is this Is this a meaningful contribution in our lives, in the donors' lives, in the community? So a lot of this is narrative work, right? So I call it
Back to
narrative
your
work
storytelling, right?
yeah, because the narratives we hold, amplify our capacity to reach people. And I think that if we focus on the external first, we're missing an opportunity to connect with someone on a deeply human level. And that deeply human level is what inspires, in my opinion, philanthropy. So another example would be, and I'm sure you've seen this well in your career too, when young fundraisers go to a donor meeting and they come back and say, well, the donor wants X,
Right.
so we can do Y. So one of my challenge questions would be, well, how did we lead that conversation? Like, did we live into what we needed as an organization, as a mission, and in the community? Like, what work do we aspire to do in the world, and how do we invite them into that? Or are we saying, well, they have capacity, they might want to fund this.
Right. Right.
And they say, actually, I don't want to fund a cancer center. I want to fund an orthopedic clinic. And that's not one of our institutional priorities. So what narrative did we shape upon going into that meeting? So back to Inside Out, it's really about connecting yourself to the work to the world, right? And then doing that same sort of reflexive exercise with the donor. So where do your stories intersect? Where do your aspirations intersect? It's people who are really relational get this sort of organically. But when we have to sell priorities as fundraisers, selling a word, for example, that is really strained in our profession.
Right.
But when we are, communicating a big dream in the world, we have to find that connective tissue between us.
Well, and would an example of that be, if I'm a nonprofit leader, and frankly, I don't really like fundraising, and maybe for reasons that can be fixed, but I came up because I believe in the mission, the program that we offer, the impact on our community, but I don't really like to quote fundraise. But are you suggesting I need to do more of storytelling about why I'm passionate about the cause? Do you think is that why these leaders, they trip themselves up because they're trying to talk metrics, or what?
Oh my God, so many things. So I love that you asked that question. So one of the examples I use often is I was working with a women's leadership org. It was a global organization. And the ED would say to me always, my heart's not in fundraising.
Exactly.
My heart's not in fundraising. And I challenged her and I said, let's process this. So part of the authentic ask work is about destabilizing that story. It's cracking into it, because what differentiates fundraising from manifesting the dream of your organization? Is it the ask itself? So people get tripped up on this idea of asking. We know the idea of asking can be challenged across industries, right? Like, it's hard to ask for things. But in the nonprofit sector, I like to ask an ED like this, let's talk about why you believe in your vision and mission. So if I put you in front of this entrepreneur and you're talking to that person about your vision and mission, at what point does that story break down? Is it because you then have to say, and in order to deliver on this dream, it's going to cost $1 million? Like, is that where the breakdown comes?
Right.
So we started to have this conversation, and she said, you're totally right. And I said, the truth of the matter is if we believe in this work, funding this work doesn't have to be a barrier to success. It's really just part of the belief system. It's that in order for me to do great work in this world, it's going to cost money, right? Yeah. And that money is going to pay dividends in the communities that we live in. So again, it's narrative work, right?
Right. And I love the way you put that. And I found personally it helped me, because I think when it appeared to be a transactional arm twisting, if you will, when I thought about, no, I'm passionate about the cause, and the person I'm speaking with is also passionate about the cause. Our narratives should intersect around a shared opportunity. I'm just facilitating their investment. And I found, I don't know if you, as a narrative expert, that just to me felt so much better than thinking about fundraising or soliciting, when it was more, hey, let's talk about an investment, and I just want to help you, do it effectively.
Well, Patton, imagine if, so I can't tell you how many orgs I've walked into that have said to me, first and foremost, we have to raise X amount of dollars.
Yeah. Talk about a
Instead of,
transaction right there. Yeah.
instead of, this is what we dream of doing in the world. Instead of, this is why our mission is going to add value in this community or across the globe. So like part of what I think traps us is that we've reduced, and this might be a longer conversation, but it's something I'm really interested in. We've
Right.
reduced fundraising to this thing we call asking or funding. When fundraising to me, or the field, the profession, is really about shaping a narrative that inspires investment. And you just said that too. It's
Right.
like, so
Right.
if I'm a consultant and I'm going in there and I'm saying, and I hear you say, we have to raise $5 to $15 million. So someone just said this to me, and I said, I want you to tell me how your program contributes to a greater humanity.
Nice. Right.
And she was stuck for a while and smiling. And I said, great, because I need to hear that in order to go sit down with someone and say, here's a really important program in a world that requires X, Y, and Z. And you know what? It's going to cost X amount of dollars.
Yeah. The numbers are secondary though, right,
Yeah.
Jennifer? The numbers
Yeah.
are secondary.
Yeah.
And I think that's so well, because I was going to ask you in as you teach narratives or the narrative storytelling aspect, do you encourage nonprofit leaders to put some numbers in there as, or how do you incorporate it? So it's not just kind of thematic storytelling, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Especially, I mean, outside of workshops, when I work with clients, we do have to concretize it, right? So I think,
Yeah, right.
again, in the spirit of both and, it's like, I say things like, we have to dream big and get real. We have to have infrastructure to ideate. We need to have a vision rooted in reality, right? And so what that means, though, it doesn't mean the reality is not going to change, right? So how many times, Patton, have you and I started a multi-million-dollar fundraising initiative that started with a figure like, I can just use a hospital, for example. We have to raise $600 million over 3 years. We had to raise 75 million in 1 year. Well, actually that 75 million turned into 100 million.
Right.
It's emergent, right? So like the numbers, and then that $1.2 billion expansion became probably closer to a $3 billion expansion. So like the aliveness of the work doesn't mean we eradicate numbers, but we have to connect the dream with the reality. And I think that if the numbers scare people, fundraisers, first of all, then we have to figure out why.
Yes.
So what, and then if we have a hard time talking numbers with donors, then we have to figure out why, so that's that inside out stuff, like what is the barrier? Because where it can be perceived on the flip side, let's say in a smaller org, if you're an ED that's running an organization that's like a $1 to $3 million organization, and you live, eat, and breathe your mission, but you are afraid to ask for $5,000, then we have to talk about that. We have to figure out why.
Could not agree more.
That means to me that there's some faith issue or belief that we're reckoning with.
But if I believe in the cause and I've kind of am authentic in the purpose of what we're trying to do, then I shouldn't be ashamed or embarrassed to put a number on that, right? As long as I can, I guess, back it up with an authentic narrative.
Yeah. And imagine, I mean, it just occurred to me while you were speaking, like if donors really are our investors and our partners, like that, dialoguing about the needs and how much they cost, like who knows, they might have expertise, right? They might have wisdom to bring to the table. And, we're in relationship with these people, right? We're not just like taking money out of their pockets.
Exactly. And again, we're using the term over and over, but that's transactional, right? It's just sales at its most basic level. And we want more than this. And in fact, I know you're such a good advocate for, and I think the phrase you use in your workshops is a culture of gratitude. Talk about that, because that to me speaks to the relational aspect here, not just, hey, I want to get your gift and then I'm, never going to see you again.
Yeah. So this is really interesting. And I love that you plucked that from my material. So on the one hand, I like to celebrate fundraising professionals to be they're really good at saying thank you, right? Like
Right.
that's a skill that we've learned, right? You write a thank you note, you call someone, you say thank you steward them over the course of the year. We've operationalized thanking. Gratitude to me is something a lot bigger. It's experiential, it's visceral, it's a place to lead from. Like, I am grateful to be doing this work. Like, it is a practice. There's a lot of research. One of the areas of interest that I also hold is the relationship with gratitude and health, physical health. You can look at gratitude and heart health and find some really interesting studies. I worked with a professor out of UC San Diego, who's now on a board that I train, on the impact of gratitude and health. But what I would really add to that inquiry here in fundraising is, it really is, I like to say, a privilege to steward this work that we're doing in the world. And if
Right.
if we use a lens of gratitude to inspire like our daily work, it also can contribute to making the ask less sort of oppressive or scary or laborious, right?
Right.
Like,
Right.
so
Right.
as an example, like, every time I have the opportunity to meet with a donor, I sit on this bridge being grateful to be able to hold a piece of the mission. If you saw my hands, I'm holding my hands
No,
on the
good,
one
good, good.
hand, right?
Right.
Grateful. I'm like this bridge between the mission and the donor. And where gratitude lives is inside me. Like, how did I get the privilege to hold and advocate for this mission, and then to sit with someone who might be interested and passionate about supporting and leveling up this mission. So it just creates a different experience. It's not a tactic of being grateful. It's like the tone and tenor of why. Again, it goes back to, why do we do this work in the first place? And one of the other phrases I use is, how are we being in this work and how are we doing this work? And being grateful allows us to do this work with greater ease.
Well, and that's perfect. And before we jump into board engagement, I guess I'd follow up that exact point. If I'm a nonprofit leader, I want to get better at this. I need to have conversations, I guess, practice these kind of narrative conversations with anybody to help me get more confident. And I also am struck by your personal practice. Would it help to write it down? Or what other advice might you give
Yeah.
me if I'm, I want to make a step? Jennifer, I hear you. I want to get better and more authentic. What do I do?
Yeah, I mean, I love this question often, right? So we work in a space that often wants us to codify things, right? Like, again, they want
Exactly.
the secret sauce to um, making the ask, right? Or the secret sauce to being authentic. It's, from my perspective, and authenticity is now all over the place. I don't own it. I don't even own the authentic ask. It's something that emerges and lives inside of us all. But I think one of the key practices that I do, and I've done this with boards, is that inquiry. Like, why am I here? Why am I doing this work?
Right.
What
Start with
about this
that.
work? Yeah, what
Yeah.
about this work matters to me? What about this work matters to the world? What's keeping me up at night about this work? What can where can I have greater influence? Like, those kind of inquiries.
Yes.
And even so, I use this often as an example too. Even before you go to a donor meeting, it's a good sort of reflective practice, because I remember as a young fundraiser, the first time I closed like a $50,000 gift, I was nervous, and I had a supervisor say to me, I use this often, I hope he doesn't listen. Um,
Right.
he said, what are the top 3 outcomes you want from that meeting? And
Okay.
and I remember going, okay, I nailed those outcomes, but I was obsessed with those outcomes during the meeting instead
Yeah.
of being present to, why am I here? What mission am I trying to serve? Those questions that I continue to ask myself, they are grounding questions. They're questions that then you can do in community and in connection with a donor or a board. And that what I have witnessed, what I have seen it do, is it transforms the person, right? Like, the person who you're in connection with, it invites them into the larger story of the work. They feel seen. They feel part of something bigger than themselves. So then when you ask them for money or you invite them to invest, more often than not, you don't even have to. They say, how can I be of service? How can I help?
So well put. And again, I'm shaking my head as I think back to many, many donor visits. And you're right. If I were smarter, like you are helping me now understand, I should have just told my story. What keeps me up at night? What are the challenges of our organization? I bet the donor would have related better to that instead of anticipating the checklist, which is, all right,
Yeah.
they're going to ask me for annual fund. They're going to ask me for campaign. They're going to try to sneak in some discussion about my estate planning, which is a checklist, kind of like your former boss kind of was looking for outcomes instead of what, Jennifer, you're suggesting now, which is just tell the story.
It's interesting, Pat, and I'll say that I want to be clear that I'm not dismissing the tactics that we use, right?
True.
Like, so we need
True.
both, right? Like, but what I'm finding is that we have to lead from a higher perspective. Like, we have to connect more deeply around the mission. The tactics are just backup, right? Like, so by the time you get to the ask, so I asked about 30 people if they could define their most authentic, meaningful ask. And so far, this is an ongoing research project.
Yeah. Tell me.
Most people said to me that they didn't have to ask at all.
That's when you knew it
Literally.
was right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I was like, oh God. Okay. So like when I talk to boards, I'm talking about, yes, we have annual giving, we have multi-year giving, we have major giving, leadership giving, principal giving, transformational giving. We can use direct mail, we can use direct response rather, or events, or
right.
all of those things. But that is where we're leading with the parts instead of the sum. People are inspired by the sum, right? The vision. They want to feel a part of the change that they want to see in the world, not a direct mail campaign. That's why the idea of a campaign to me is always so interesting to me. I think a campaign is important and it's interesting and it gives beginning, middle, end to funding a need. But if we lead with the campaign, what happens at the end? We're just done.
It's a transactional timeline then, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or could be at risk of that.
And we see higher ed institutions then go, well, we just did a $2 billion campaign. And now a year later, they're launching another one.
Exactly. And no wonder our profession, sometimes they're rolling their eyes at us for exactly that reason, instead of, maybe talking more about the impact. And well, Jennifer, this is fantastic. But I want to get to board stuff because I bet, like you, I hear from so many nonprofit leaders in one of two camps. Either my board's driving me crazy because maybe they're trying to micromanage, or they're disengaged. And so either scenario is not good. So how do you advise, nonprofit leaders to better engage their board?
Oh, gosh, so interesting.
It's kind of open-ended. I know I left you a pretty open-ended question there.
Well, it's interesting because I was just thinking about how I just worked with a board, believe it or not, Patton, that was paid to serve. And we have now flipped the culture from being paid to serve, which was before I got there.
Yeah, right.
To one where they all have a minimum giving requirement. Minimum giving / facilitated giving requirement. And when I dug into the real barriers at this particular org, the barriers were about trust in leadership, trust in the mission, trust in management. I mean, it was such a really interesting multi-year experience for me to see the work that we needed to do with this board to turn the culture around. And it's still evolving. But what I will say, this is not really new for development professionals to really employ, but it is about, like, I think interacting with board members individually and collectively. Again, it goes back to getting down inside themselves, like trying to understand really like what inspires them and activates them to be meaningful participants on a board.
Right.
Knowing who they are, not just like treating them as, ambassador, or I guess I would just say connectors to funds. Like what makes them tick. It's that relational work.
Yeah, we treat them just like fundraisers, then we might get what we asked for, either or likely because they're not comfortable there. And if I do see that a lot too, Jennifer, don't you? We're recruiting board members almost with that obvious, well, we just need your money and your ability to raise money, and that doesn't feel very authentic either.
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. So I'll tell you a story about a conversation I had with someone recently, a board member who just made his first gift to the org, who probably was considering leaving this board for the last 2 years.
Wow.
And we had a one-on-one via Zoom because we're still in a pandemic. And I got as a consultant, I got to ask some bigger questions about how, just the storytelling questions. But then we were talking about how he participates and what he was capable of giving. And I said, look, as a fundraising professional, I want you to know that we will never compromise your connections or the integrity of your work by pushing you to ask people uncomfortably. What I'd like to do is uplift your work and find meaningful ways for people who want to align with you to support your work on the board, so that you don't feel like you are holding fast to this high price tag, like I have to give this much. Like, this is facilitated giving, right? So I said to him, let's talk about what that looks like. You're giving talks over the next year. Like, what if there is a business in your network that might find it really exciting to align with you? Like, that might be a really great opportunity to have this person's brand aligned with your talk and support an organization that matters to you, that means a lot to you.
You changed the perspective though, didn't you? With just that.
He emailed someone literally right after the call and copied me. And I said, look, it's just an invitation to align and kind of celebrate each other's, meaningful work in the world, right? You're creating health in individuals. You're serving on a board that's doing X, Y, and Z. And this company is an asset in that, again, larger narrative about how we're going to create health and humanity. So much of the stuff, Patton, I know I'm like on rinse and repeat,
no,
but
it's okay.
To me, it's the breakdown is our approach. Like, one of the things that I'm dying to write about, and we'll probably soon after this call, is about our reputation. And I remember when someone likened fundraising professionals to used car salesmen.
Yes.
I also feel really sad for used car salesmen.
Yeah,
because,
no, we always use them as the bad example, don't we?
Yeah. It's like, I feel really sad for them. But, it's like, what does that mean? How is that tarnished the way we see ourselves in the work? Like, if we feel like it's gross, then do you think the donor isn't going to feel that?
Absolutely right.
Or the board member, like, it feels so scarcity mindset to say, we have to raise this money or we will never do X. It's like, let's flip that at the board level. I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, no, and I was going to ask you, I think you did. And in fact, in settings where we have conversations with the board in a retreat or session or whatever, it's more important to get them to talk about why they're there and their commitment to the cause. I guess, in other words, the mistake I think we make is we have sessions and talk about how they can fundraise more, which immediately I think jumps to a transactional kind of relationship that they're not comfortable.
And I would add, for many board members or faculty at universities, it can feel like more work. So another example that I often use that really was like a turning point for me in my career, I had to raise money for drug discovery. And there were these brilliant scientists, intellectual rigor, esteemed, globally renowned, so busy. Meeting with them was always robust and inspiring. I could barely get in front of them.
Exactly.
But when I did, the breakdown always came, like, what individuals are going to invest in this work? We're not going to find, there was always this like, no gun happening. And I asked one question, and it changed the course of our work together. I said, where are you speaking this month? And he goes, I'm speaking at IBM. And I said, how many people are going to be in that audience? He said, maybe 150.
Wow.
And I said, what do you plan to talk about? And he goes, well, I'm going to talk about the research. And I said, were you planning to tell them that there's philanthropic opportunities to get involved? And he's like, no. And I said, and I paused.
Yeah, let
Then,
him answer that, right?
yeah. And so at that point, the light went on. I said, you don't have to do any more work. All you're going to
Yes.
say is there's an opportunity here to participate. All you have to do after that is get me the name of the attendees. We're going to follow up with a thank you note. And then we're going to talk about how your work is going to contribute to, X, Y, and Z in the world. So again, there's these approaches that I think we can use. Off my team back then used to say, Jen, if I hear you say, flip the script again, I'm going to go bonkers. But I always say, like, how do we flip the script? And that means at the board level, they don't have to do more work. They just have to share what they love about the organization that they serve on, or the board that they serve on. Faculty, just tell me what's really important and exciting about what you're doing here. And like, our job is, as a fundraiser, is to be a conduit to their story. Like,
Yeah.
and then we could be the ones that do the the asking, right? The presenting, the inviting in,
They just get us in the door, or they create an
Yeah.
opportunity, right? And I love that, because I think, again, we're guilty as nonprofit leaders often of pushing a one size fits all kind of fundraising tactic or plan on our
Mhm.
board. And instead of what I think you brilliantly did, which is in essence, talk to each board member individually, what's going on in your world in the next month. And
Yeah.
I bet they will realize, as your colleague there did, hey, maybe I do have an audience sometime that could help.
Yeah. And I don't have to do much other than do what I was planning to do, and then say, you're going to hear from us in the months
Incorporate.
ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jennifer, that's fantastic. Is there anything else in this kind of arena of board engagement? But those are some great takeaways for sure. But anything else you might add to how we can get our boards better involved or more comfortable in this
Yeah.
authentic asking world?
This is really a very, very simple tweak. But I think it's really, really important, especially in a time like now, where we're digitally we're digitally connecting, and we're not
Right.
always meeting in person. So board members they're not often together now. So we're not around a table, and they're certainly not in the field or on campus or at your site. So there is a fundamental disconnect between the mission and the experience. So one of the things that I like to tell people to do is to start every meeting with a mission moment, like invite them into the mission, like right
Yes.
out of, instead
Yes.
of going straight to a fundraising dashboard or your agenda, something like, before we start this meeting, we want to take a moment to do X. So whether that's read testimonials, show them a video, give them some sort of experiential reason to continue to
It's a
serve.
reminder, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. Well, and Jennifer, I guess I'll add one final question then. As people, we have listeners that are experienced nonprofit leaders, but we have some that are new to the field, or maybe even thinking about joining the field at all. What do you say to someone like that who comes up to you and says, yeah, I'm thinking about jumping from for-profit to nonprofit, or I'm just graduating from college and thinking about nonprofit? Is there any kind of key advice you offer someone like that?
I don't know if I've answered that directly, but when you had seeded that earlier, I thought, I wrote on my notepad I wrote head and heart down with a big circle, head
Yeah.
and heart.
Tell me what you mean by that.
And I think working in the nonprofit sector or the social sector, or even corporate giving or corporate citizenship, offers humans a real opportunity to lead with their head and their heart. It's my hope that we live in a world where it doesn't matter what your tax status is to lead that way. But here in our sector is a real opportunity to filter your leadership capabilities, not just through your head, but through your heart. Like, connect
Nice.
with the work, know that it's going to be again, emergent rebirthing process every day, like renegotiation process. The shadow side of that experience can be, we can get heartbroken on the job, right? So
Right.
but that, again, that offers us an opportunity to stretch and grow, and again, connect with ourselves, our teams, our orgs, our mission, our donors in the world. So filter your interests through your head and your heart. That would be my answer.
So well put. No, it's beautifully put, and not surprising as a narrative expert that you clearly are. And it reminds me of conversations that I've had a lot of times. I'm in Charlotte, where there's a lot of financial services kind of professionals here who will come to me and say, you know what, I'm using my head, have used my head for 20 years, but not the heart. And so I love the way you kind of articulate nonprofit leadership allows you to use both. And that may be the best kind of motivational slogan we could offer, because the nonprofit sector needs talented people. And so I'm glad you have invited them in if they're not already with us. Jennifer, if I can ask you the one more favor, a parting gift, because this has been wonderful. A book, maybe two, but at least one that maybe has shaped you along your kind of nonprofit leadership journey that you might recommend to our listeners?
Yeah. Gosh, so many. If you saw where I was sitting.
You're looking at a lot of examples. Yeah, right.
So many. So, I mean, anyone who reads anything I write knows that I'm a fan of Brene Brown's research and her work.
Sure.
But a woman that I'm really enjoying right now, especially at this sort of pivotal reckoning moment that we're in our nation, is a woman named Adrienne Maree Brown. Wrote Emergent Strategy, and it's emergent strategy shaping change and changing worlds, and it's just really been illuminating to me to see the way in which she talks about movement design and also organizational leadership and growth. So that's a new one for me.
Fantastic.
And gosh, so many more. I was
going to say, I know you're tempted to add more, and Chris, you reference Henry Nouwen. I've had several guests reference what is it, the spirituality of giving, I think.
The spirituality of fundraising.
Yeah, sorry.
Lynn Twist's Soul of Money. My dear friend and mentor, Kathy LeMay's The Generosity Plan. But, I read a lot outside of our profession, frankly, and translate it into our work.
Fantastic. And well, speaking of your work, before we let you go, where can people find out more about you and the good work you're doing, Jennifer?
Oh, thank you so much. So I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So you can find me Jennifer Harris on LinkedIn, or you could probably hashtag authentic ask and see what I've been playing with.
Right.
I also, my website is jhcollectiveinc.com, but most active on LinkedIn.
We will happily link and connect all of those resources and ways to get a hold of you, Jennifer. And thank you so much for joining me on The Path.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Jennifer as much as I did and came away with some really practical ideas that can guide your professional journey and, frankly, enhance the critical fundraising skill that you will need to master as you lead a nonprofit organization. Don't forget the show notes. They are available on our website, pattonmcdowell.com, where you can find more about Jennifer, the Authentic Ask, and the workshops she does related to that. And look out for some great content that she's producing all the time. You'll want to make sure you connect with her so that you can read more. As always, thanks for sharing this episode with someone else on the path. If you haven't already, you can subscribe. Just go to the podcast page at pattonmcdowell.com and you'll see links to all of the primary podcast platforms. Don't miss out on any of these weekly episodes. They come out every Thursday, as well as bonus features we're producing at least once a month. Thanks for all you're doing in the nonprofit sector, especially right now, and keep up the good work for causes that are most meaningful to you. I'll keep bringing you content that can help you do it even better. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time on The Path.